28 years ago, Serena Grant, a 23-year-old girl in Jackson, Tennessee, vanished into the night after a fierce argument, leaving her family in speechless horror. Authorities suspected her boyfriend, who appeared at every key timeline milestone, but there was no body, no direct evidence, and far too few leads to pursue, causing the investigation to quickly stall. However, throughout those long years, Serena's family never gave up hope, clinging to any small detail that might lead them to the truth. Then one day, while old case files were being reviewed again, a piece of evidence lost for nearly 3 decades surfaced a seemingly tiny detail, powerful enough to turn the entire case upside down and shake the Jackson community. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love content like this, don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. That evening in Jackson, Tennessee was steeped in muggy air, with the faint smell of hot earth after a long, sweltering day. Streetlights cast pale gold across the quiet sidewalks and parking lot of the Woods Creek apartment complex. There was no breeze. The last scattered cicadas buzzed in the trees behind the buildings, creating a heavy feeling as if everything was being held tight in an unexplainable hush. In that stillness, an unusual sound broke out from the second floor. Loud shouting between 2 people. Voices rising higher, sharper, angrier, mixed with the clatter of objects crashing and a harsh door slam echoing down the hallway. A few doors cracked open, a few faces peeked out toward the stairwell. Everyone recognized it was the apartment of Serena Grant and her boyfriend, Evan Marshall. The argument continued. No one could make out the exact words, only the thick, heavy tone of pent-up rage. Then came a heavy thud, as if something fell or was shoved hard. Right after that, the apartment door flew open, and Serena appeared at the head of the hallway. Her hastily tied hair was a mess, her light-colored t-shirt wrinkled at the shoulders, her face a mix of disappointment, panic, and anger that hadn't yet faded. Serena's steps were fast and decisive, not the kind of leaving to get some air, but the kind of fleeing a place you couldn't stand another second. She had no purse, no phone, no keys. Even the flip-flops on her feet were half off one strap. A neighbor leaning in their doorway clearly noticed that detail because as Serena hurried down the stairs, the loose strap slapped lightly but rhythmically against each step, contrasting with her frantic pace. When she crossed the courtyard, the yellow light stretched her shadow long across the concrete, making her hurried walk stand out even more in the otherwise silent space. Someone on the ground floor also saw her leave the complex, heading straight for the main gate without looking back. They noticed her flushed face and rapid breathing, as if she'd just poured all her energy into the argument minutes earlier. From the moment Serena stepped through the gate, no one in the complex saw her again. No one heard footsteps returning, no one saw anyone pick her up, and there was no other movement suggesting Serena was still around the apartment area. As the night grew darker, her family called her repeatedly with no answer. The phone just rang, and then went to voicemail, showing no sign she'd ever picked up. Worry turned to panic, as every attempt to reach her failed. The family immediately drove to Woods Creek Apartments, rang the buzzer, called Serena's name, knocked repeatedly, but only got flickering light from inside, and thick silence. Evan stepped out, face tense, eyes avoiding contact. He said curtly that Serena left after they fought, but the apartment showed no signs she'd prepared to leave. No bag packed, no missing clothes, no sign of travel. His answer only deepened their unease. They searched around the complex, asked a few neighbors, and received the same information. Serena walked out to the gate on foot, and no one saw her after that. After nearly an hour of searching with no sign of her, the family decided to call the Jackson police to report her missing. Serena Grant, 23 years old, was officially recorded as missing that very night. The first patrol car from the Jackson Police Department pulled up in front of the Woods Creek apartment complex, its red and blue lights sweeping lightly across the dew-glistened brick faces. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the surrounding area with the familiar gaze of those who've handled many missing persons cases. But this time the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Serena's family stood near the stairwell, waiting for them with unmistakable worry etched on their faces. Upon hearing the description of Serena leaving without any personal belongings, One officer immediately noted in the report that this was not a typical voluntary departure. Serena and Evan's apartment was opened for the police to inspect. The lights inside revealed a scene of disarray. Chairs pulled out of place, a few small items from the kitchen table knocked to the floor, the tablecloth shoved askew. No blood was visible, no clear signs of serious injury, but the entire room carried the tense residue of a just-ended fierce argument. The second officer swept a flashlight across surfaces, spotting several scratches on the edge of the table and a long scrape along the face of a cabinet. All documented in the scene report. Evan stood leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on empty space as if avoiding eye contact at all costs. When the police asked him to describe what happened, he spoke in a low, even voice, head not bowed, never looking directly at anyone. He said they had argued about personal matters, and Serena had stormed out in anger. When pressed about the content of the argument, Evan gave very vague and evasive answers, only saying that Serena wasn't happy with a lot of things, and that he didn't want to say more because it was private. His voice didn't tremble, but his jaw clenched every time he mentioned Serena. One officer noted, Evan's emotional response did not match the situation of someone close to him having gone missing in the night. They continued questioning him about the last time he saw Serena. Evan answered uncertainly, changing small details between statements like where he was standing when Serena walked out the door, or how long it took before he realized she wasn't coming back. These minor inconsistencies were recorded in the report because they indicated an unstable account. While one group of officers spoke with Evan, the others went down to the front courtyard, interviewing neighbors who had seen Serena leave the complex. A woman on the ground floor described Serena's tense facial expression very clearly, the way she walked quickly and carried nothing with her. A man from the apartment nearest the main gate confirmed seeing Serena step out through the gate in a hurry, head slightly down, shoulders rigid, but he saw no one following her or any vehicle stopping to pick her up. They were also asked about the argument sounds, and several people said they heard fairly loud shouting before Serena left the apartment. This information reinforced the assessment that the incident was not simply leaving to cool off from an argument but potentially involved serious conflict. The police returned to the apartment for a more thorough check of physical evidence. One officer, wearing gloves, lifted the overturned chair to examine its edges for signs of heavy impact. A glass tumbler that had rolled under the table was picked up and placed into an evidence bag. These small details didn't reveal much, but they illustrated the level of tension in the argument right before Serena left. During the sweep, one officer noticed a large open space between the kitchen and living room where there was no disturbance, as if the conflict had been confined to a specific area. This observation was added to the report for later analysis, as it could help determine movement patterns or positions of the two during the argument. Evan's behavior continued to draw police attention. He didn't ask them any questions about the search process or investigation direction, nor did he inquire about Serena's possible whereabouts. When asked why he hadn't called Serena's family or the police when she left, Evan said he thought she just went out for a few minutes to calm down. The answer raised suspicion because, according to neighbors, Serena had left the complex quite a while before the family arrived. One investigator noted in his notebook, "Emotional response inappropriate. Further questioning needed." After nearly an hour at the scene and interviewing those involved, the police made an internal assessment. The disappearance had many unusual elements. Serena left without personal items, no contact with family, preceded by a heated argument. Evan's account was uncertain and showed signs of evasion. The scene indicated a physical altercation. Collectively, these factors led them to classify the case as missing under suspicious circumstances, a much higher category than voluntary disappearance. The on-duty night shift police chief requested the immediate formation of a dedicated investigative team to handle the case. A sergeant was assigned to coordinate, 2 detectives were tasked with expanded interviews, and the forensics team was instructed to return to the apartment early the next morning for more detailed collection. The official investigation began in the tense atmosphere of a night that was no longer simply a missing person case. As the interrogation moved into the second round of questioning, the investigators focused entirely on checking the consistency in Evan's statements. Questions were repeated with the same content, but rephrased in different structures to observe his natural reactions. In the first asking, Evan said Serena left the apartment a little after 8 o'clock, his voice firm and showing no hesitation. When asked again with a different wording, Evan said Serena stepped out the door around close to 9 o'clock, and when pressed to be more specific, he only replied that he didn't remember exactly because things were so chaotic at the time. The nearly 1-hour discrepancy in the timeline was far too significant in the context of a disappearance, especially given Serena's highly charged behavior just before. One investigator immediately noted, "Unstable on the timeline." When asked about the volume of the argument, Evan initially said they were just arguing normally and the noise wasn't loud enough to draw attention. However, neighbors from 2 different apartments both confirmed hearing clear shouting and the sound of objects crashing echoing down the hallway. When the investigator brought up that neighbors said they heard Serena yelling loudly, Evan's face changed for a split second. Then he said things might have gotten louder than I remember. Still, his tone didn't match the explanation he was giving. His voice stayed low and even, showing none of the confusion or remorse you'd expect from someone genuinely confronted with conflicting information. This was observed and noted by an investigator sitting behind. Emotional state doesn't align with the content of the statement. When asked about Serena's demeanor right before she left the apartment, Evan said she went out to get some air and would probably come back soon. However, all witnesses described Serena leaving the apartment in a near-running state, with heavy, rapid steps, rigid shoulders, and an expression of anger and confusion. Evan described Serena as walking normally, nothing out of the ordinary, not crying, not yelling, which completely contradicted the accounts from those who saw her. The gap between these 2 sets of descriptions forced the investigators to go back over every word Evan said. They asked him to recount in detail how Serena closed the door, how she went down the stairs, but Evan dodged with responses like, "I don't remember every little action. Everything happened too fast." This very avoidance highlighted the suspicious nature, because those exact details were remembered precisely by the neighbors down to the gestures. During the questioning, the investigators also paid close attention to Evan's body language. When the argument was mentioned, Evan's shoulders rose slightly, his arms crossed tightly, and his thumbs kept pressing into the inside of the opposite arm. When Serena leaving the apartment came up, Evan's eyes shifted to the left instead of looking straight at the investigator. These unconscious reactions often appear when someone is fabricating or concealing part of the truth. One investigator trained in behavioral analysis noted, Evan shows signs of avoiding genuine memory imagery, behaving like someone reconstructing a story. When asked why he didn't immediately call Serena's family or the police when she left, Evan tried to weave in a side story to divert attention. He said Serena had mentioned many times wanting to leave Jackson to escape the stress, that she had talked about going somewhere else to start over, and that her walking out of the apartment on foot wasn't anything to worry about. Evan offered this explanation in hopes of downplaying the urgency of the disappearance and framing it as a voluntary decision. However, the investigators immediately countered with the fact that Serena had taken no purse, no money, no phone, or any personal items. Evan had no reasonable answer, only repeating, she'd said she wanted to leave. When the investigator asked who could confirm that, Evan avoided eye contact and said he wasn't sure who knew. Evan's attempt to use the idea of leaving Jackson to explain the disappearance was flagged as a clear effort to construct a narrative favorable to himself. This story didn't match Serena's daily habits, didn't match her behavior that day, and completely failed to align with witness descriptions. By the end of the interview session, although there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest, the police unanimously recorded Evan Marshall as a person of interest. The points of suspicion included changing the timeline, misrepresenting the intensity of the argument, inaccurately describing Serena's state of mind, evading multiple direct questions, and attempting to steer the disappearance toward a voluntary departure. The forensics team was deployed back to the apartment at dawn, when the Jackson sky was still covered in a light mist that made the yellow lights in the complex look hazier than usual. Inside, the apartment remained exactly as it had been when the family discovered Serena was no longer there, a heavy stillness enveloping the space, contrasting with the chaotic traces that became clearer under the specialized lights. The forensics group moved slowly, each person assigned to one area, observing surfaces while marking any anomalies that appeared in their line of sight. The living room area was where they started. The sofa was shifted out of its usual position. The coffee table slightly rotated at an angle, and one leg of the table had left a long streak imprinted on the wooden floor, as if it had been pushed with significant force. Those details weren't enough to determine the level of conflict, but they suggested an unnatural kind of movement, the kind a calm person wouldn't create. One technician recorded the depth of the skid mark on the floor, comparing it with the direction the nearby chair had fallen to see what kind of motion could have caused both objects to end up displaced like that. The room had no heavy furniture overturned, but the repeated small disturbances in multiple spots created the feeling that two people had struggled there. In the kitchen, where light reflecting off the stainless steel cabinets revealed faint scratch marks, forensics swept crossbeams with flashlights to examine the surfaces closely. On the floor, a few shards of glass lay next to the base of the lower cabinet. The glass that had been collected the previous night was re-examined to determine its point of origin. Based on the scatter pattern of the glass fragments and the way the tumbler had cracked and broken, the technician concluded the glass had most likely fallen from about hand height and not from a gentle slide. On the countertop, faint drag marks from two metal objects suggested a story of haste or conflict right before Serena left the apartment. These signs appeared more in the kitchen area than the living room, as if the epicenter of the argument had been there. Amid that chaotic surface, one detail made the forensics team pause longer. On the edge of the counter near the kitchen, not far from where the glass had broken, was a small dark brown spot the size of a pinhead, right along the wood trim. The forensics team used a cotton swab to collect a sample, and the rapid reaction of the protein test reagent confirmed it was blood. The amount was far too small to be visible as an obvious trace to the naked eye, and in the conditions of 1996, the technology for analysis wasn't advanced enough to extract DNA from such a trace amount. Even so, its presence confirmed that there had been physical contact resulting in bleeding in that area. No one could conclude whether that blood belonged to Serena, Evan, or some other source, but its location aligned perfectly with the conflict zone in the kitchen. Forensics continued checking the front door, hinges, door edges, and lock. None showed signs of forced entry. No fresh scratches on the key or doorknob. No unfamiliar footprints tracked in from outside onto the mat. These details ruled out the possibility of an intruder using force from the exterior. The intact appearance of the door and lock indicated the incident originated inside the apartment, between people who had legitimate access without needing to break in. When combined with neighbors' statements that they hadn't seen anyone else come up the stairs besides Serena, the closed-door scenario further focused attention on those who had been present in the apartment before Serena walked out. The bedroom showed no significant signs of disturbance. Bedding wasn't torn or yanked. Items on the nightstand remained neatly in place. This allowed forensics to narrow the conflict area, redirecting attention back to the living room and kitchen, where there were enough indicators of intense confrontation between two people. The bathroom was also checked. No water splashed around, no towels thrown to the floor. Everything remained as a regular user would typically leave it, from the position of the shampoo bottle to the neatly hung face towel. The only way to explain this stability was that the bathroom area had no involvement in the events leading to Serena's departure. When they returned to the kitchen area, the investigator noted that the disturbance occurred within a confined space, but was sufficient to visualize that the interaction involved more than just words. A bar stool had been shoved away from the kitchen counter, its angled tilt suggesting it had been pushed by someone's hip or thigh rather than falling naturally. A paper towel, still partially pulled from the dispenser, remained on the counter, indicating the situation had unfolded so quickly that no one had time to tidy up or even pause to grab something like a paper towel. These small details couldn't serve as conclusive evidence, but they spoke to the level of tension in the conflict inside the apartment. In the hallway leading to the door, forensics examined the tiled floor for unfamiliar footprints or dirt tracked in from outside. The floor was clean, with only faint old shoe marks unrelated to the time of Serena's disappearance. The investigator clearly noted that there was no evidence whatsoever of anyone forcing entry from outside. The absence of strange footprints reinforced the conclusion that all significant events had taken place among those living in the apartment. When compiling the notes, the investigator determined the apartment carried all the elements of a point of origin for criminal behavior, including signs of conflict, argument sounds confirmed by witnesses, and an unexplained blood spot on the counter edge. Nevertheless, every detail remained fragmented, lacking a direct piece of evidence to shift the case toward homicide. There was no body, no sufficient quantity of blood, no signs of a victim being moved within the apartment. The examination results left behind a heavy, suggestive picture, but nothing definitive enough to name clearly. All the data showed that Serena had left the apartment in a state of distress, and the traces in the room served only as evidence of the confrontational atmosphere right before she vanished. The investigators began sweeping the entire area in front of Woods Creek Apartments to determine Serena's path of movement after leaving the apartment. They knocked on doors of every nearby residence along the same road, asking if they had any security cameras or recording devices pointed toward the street. Several households on the same block had systems mounted on porches or over garages, mostly older VHS tape types used to monitor their front yards. The investigative team collected the tapes covering the time frame when Serena was seen leaving the complex and brought them back to review frame by frame according to procedure. The footage obtained wasn't sharp due to the limitations of the equipment at that time, but it was still sufficient to identify body shape, direction of travel, and general motion. In one segment of footage, a porch camera from a house about 50 meters from the complex gate captured Serena walking from the direction illuminated by the gate light. She was moving quickly, head slightly bowed, arms hanging loose at her sides, steps steady but tense. No one was following behind her, no one appeared coming from the opposite direction, and no vehicle stopped beside her within the camera's range. This image matched the neighbor's statements that Serena left the complex alone, adding accuracy to the timeline. The investigators rewound and replayed the final seconds on that camera to see which way Serena turned, but the angle only captured her until she stepped out of frame, moving into a darker stretch of road and disappearing completely. The police continued gathering footage from two other houses located a few dozen meters past the eastward turn. One camera facing the main road recorded vehicle traffic but did not show Serena appearing. Another camera positioned higher on the opposite porch overlooked a wooded area, but had its view obstructed over the portion of the roadway where Serena might have passed. The fact that Serena did not appear in any footage after the first camera forced the investigative team to redraw a map of possible routes she could have taken. From the complex gate, Serena had only three options: continue straight along the main road, turn left into the less lit section, or turn right toward the more populated residential area. However, two of the three directions had resident cameras. If Serena had gone either of those ways, the chance of being captured on video would have been higher. Her complete absence from all angles made the possibility that she entered a low visibility zone or left the area by vehicle stand out as noteworthy. Witnesses living near the complex gate stated they saw no vehicle stop right when Serena walked out, nor did they see Serena get into anyone's car. People who were walking or jogging at that time also did not report encountering Serena along the road. One man walking his dog recalled that the dog didn't react to anyone during the stretch from his house to the small nearby park, indirectly confirming that no woman had passed by during the time he was out. When cross-referenced with the time Serena left the complex, this overlap further reinforced the assessment that she did not walk far from the main gate. The investigators evaluated all the collected data and recognized a large gap appearing immediately after Serena passed beyond the range of residential cameras. The place where she vanished was a short stretch of road, but one with poor visibility due to low-hanging trees, blocking sightlines and streetlights spaced far apart. This was an ideal spot for a vehicle to stop very briefly without being recorded in any frame. The possibility that Serena stepped into a vehicle fit the visual gap and the quietness of the area at that time. This did not rule out the chance she was forced into a car, but it also could not be confirmed, because no one witnessed anything unusual, such as a struggle or shouting. One resident right next to the dark stretch said he was watching television and didn't hear a vehicle stop. But he also admitted the windows were closed and the air conditioning was running, so it would have been easy to miss outside sounds. The absence of any further images of Serena after that initial moment forced the investigation to rely on inference rather than direct evidence. The investigators marked this area as a critical blind spot. A short section of road but long enough for Serena to disappear completely without leaving any clear trace. The investigation map was updated, with the area of highest priority highlighted in bold for the next steps of follow-up sweeps. Determining Serena's final direction of travel did not provide answers, but it pinpointed exactly where her trail stopped the end of her walking path, and also the starting point of the vanishing that left all search efforts falling into an inexplicable void. When the investigative team cross-referenced Evan's statements with what had been discovered in the apartment, many inconsistencies began to stand out clearly. Evan said the argument wasn't that intense, that the two of them just talked back and forth for a bit and then Serena walked out. But the traces in the apartment showed a very different kind of chaos. Chairs displaced, a broken glass, items disturbed, and a trace amount of blood on the counter edge. These details contradicted the mild picture Evan described. When investigators asked why there had been loud crashing sounds and shouting that multiple neighbors clearly confirmed hearing, Evan only replied that things might have been louder than I thought, or they must have misheard. Those answers raised red flags for the investigators, because Evan showed no confusion when confronted with key details. Instead, he remained strangely calm, as if he wanted to steer clear of any emotional details related to Serena. Throughout the interrogation session, Evan barely changed the tone of his voice, never asked any follow-up questions about the search process, and showed no signs of impatience or distress. This lack of reaction was noted as inappropriate for a boyfriend who had just witnessed his girlfriend vanish without a trace. When the argument was brought up, Evan kept his arms crossed, his gaze directed at the floor, or into empty space rather than at the investigators. Every time he was asked about the content of the dispute, he gave very short answers, almost deliberately avoiding revealing the true level of tension between them. His minimally expressive face and even tone created the impression that Evan was trying to hide something rather than cooperate to clarify events. One investigator noted, "No natural signs of concern for a missing person." A preliminary check of the timeline Evan presented continued to raise numerous points of suspicion. Evan claimed he left the apartment to go look for Serena about a few minutes after she walked out. However, neighbors on the lower floor said they heard no male footsteps coming down the stairs during that time frame. A family living directly across from the stairwell also stated they had their door open about 5 minutes after Serena left, but they saw no sign of Evan leaving the apartment at all. These statements did not match the timing Evan provided, proving either that his movement didn't happen or didn't occur as he described. When asked specifically which direction he went to look for Serena, Evan answered vaguely, only saying, "I walked around the complex a bit," but when pressed to describe the route, he couldn't provide an answer. In an effort to explain Serena leaving in the middle of the night, Evan kept emphasizing that she had expressed a desire to leave Jackson. He said Serena had talked about starting over somewhere else, that she wanted to escape the pressure and didn't like the environment here. But when investigators checked these claims with Serena's family and friends, everyone denied it. No one had ever heard Serena express any intention to leave Jackson, and there were no signs she was preparing for such a major change. In fact, Serena's co-workers said she was signing up for extra shifts and planning to apply for a new position in the coming months. Completely opposite to the image of someone wanting to leave everything behind and go elsewhere. One of Serena's close friends recounted that Serena had never mentioned leaving Jackson, especially not in the context of a heated argument. She added that Serena always took her purse and phone when leaving the house, even if she was just walking to the nearby store. This made Serena stepping out of the apartment without any personal items even more unusual, and Evan's explanation grew increasingly baseless. No witnesses supported the story about Serena's alleged desire to leave Jackson that Evan kept repeating, leading the investigative team to record this as a clear attempt to misdirect attention away from what happened inside the apartment before Serena disappeared. When compiling all the pieces of information, the signs of disturbance in the home, the loud argument sounds, the trace blood, Evan's inconsistent statements, his inappropriate calmness, and the lack of anyone confirming Serena wanted to leave, Jackson's suspicion toward Evan rose markedly. He was the only person present in the apartment with Serena before she vanished, the only one providing a timeline no one else witnessed, and the only one describing the level of conflict in complete opposition to the witnesses. Even so, the police did not have sufficient physical evidence to make an arrest. There was no large enough quantity of blood to indicate serious violent behavior. No body, no signs Serena had been forced out of the apartment, and no camera footage or witnesses seeing Evan take her away. All the suspicions rested on Evan's behavior, statements, and inconsistencies. While the legal elements still couldn't form a basis for charges, the police continued to keep Evan on the list of key persons of interest, recording his demeanor and statements as important data. But they couldn't move any further yet. The atmosphere of the investigation grew heavier, as every sign pointed in one direction. Yet a decisive piece was still missing to shift toward stronger action. The investigative team began considering the possibility that Serena left the area not by walking but via a vehicle, because based on the last camera footage captured, she disappeared too quickly upon stepping into the dark stretch of road. The investigators assessed that under late-night conditions, dim lighting, limited visibility, and with no personal belongings on her, it would have been difficult for Serena to go far on foot without leaving additional traces. The fact that she vanished completely from all residential cameras within a short radius gave this assessment even more weight. To reinforce the judgment, they built a map of the area surrounding Woods Creek Apartments, marking every possible route Serena might have taken or been taken through, with special focus on places with weak lighting, dense tree areas, and spots where a vehicle's movement could be concealed for a very short time. Right behind the apartment complex was a small wooded area extending to an undeveloped vacant lot where residents occasionally dumped trash or parked temporarily. The access road into this area was just a narrow dirt path, wide enough for a pickup truck or SUV. This was a place few people paid attention to, especially at night. Investigators went to survey the scene, shining lights along the edges of the dirt road, checking the dry mud and tire tracks. But since the time was already late, the ground was dry with no recent rain. The old tire marks were jumbled together, making it impossible to determine when they appeared. Though no clear new traces were found, they still noted the area as suspicious due to its secluded nature and potential for cover. From that vacant lot, a few small roads led into areas without streetlights or with sparse housing. One of these routes connected to a side road that intersected the main road about 5 minutes' drive from the complex. If a vehicle had stopped to pick up Serena or carried Serena away when she was no longer able to determine her direction, then this stretch could have been used to leave the area without drawing attention. In the time of 1996, many roads in Jackson lacked traffic cameras, and residential cameras were not common either. This created a series of blind spots that made reconstructing the journey out of the complex far more difficult. The investigators continued sweeping a narrow road running along the back of the complex, where household trash was often collected before the pickup truck arrived. This location was dark and saw little foot traffic at night, making it suitable for a brief vehicle stop without detection. They observed the area, shining lights into every corner, wall, and patch of ground obscured by trash bins, but found no signs that Serena had stood or fallen there. Still, it remained a potential spot for a vehicle to pause for just a few seconds without entering anyone's line of sight. In the opposite direction, near the main road, a short alley led to an old storage shed area where people used to store excess items or discard things. These sheds had crooked wooden doors, streaked walls, and thick darkness enveloping them. Though no direct traces were found, investigators still noted this as a potential site if someone wanted to temporarily hide a person or get someone into a vehicle without being noticed. Every marked point shared a common feature: secluded, dark, easily accessible by vehicle, and within the range Serena could have reached in the few minutes after leaving the complex gate. Since no one saw Serena walk farther, and cameras captured her in no direction afterward, the investigative team concluded that the likelihood she entered a vehicle was very high. But the most important question was, who was driving? Evan owned an old pickup truck. When asked the first time, he said he did not leave the apartment during the period after Serena left. But this statement was called into question because neighbors didn't see him leave the building, contradicting his own description, and because he couldn't explain exactly what he did in the nearly 1 hour following the argument. Investigators checked the position of Evan's parked vehicle when they arrived. The truck was present in the lot when police got there, but that didn't confirm it had been there the entire time since Serena vanished. Since no one had directly observed the vehicle during the earlier period, the investigative team tried to ask additional witnesses about engine sounds, headlights turning on, or car door closing noises, but most residents said they were inside with doors closed. Some were watching TV or sleeping, so they heard nothing clearly. The absence of street cameras meant every hypothesis involving a vehicle had to rely on scene evaluation and time gaps. Since Serena couldn't have walked far without being captured on camera, and she didn't return to the apartment, her departure by vehicle became the most reasonable assumption. Investigators reviewed Evan's statements again, cross-referencing them with the blind spots in Serena's path, and noted his repeated attempts to steer the narrative toward Serena wanted to leave Jackson as a deliberate sign of evasion. They couldn't prove Evan had driven Serena away, but the indirect elements forced the entire team to pay closer attention to the pickup truck, as well as Evan's precise whereabouts in the time following the argument. The route sweep produced no specific evidence, but it created a map of critical dark spots, places where a vehicle could stop, a person could be taken, and a trace could vanish without anyone seeing. Investigators recorded these locations in the file as points needing more thorough checking, because Serena's disappearance could only have occurred in a confined space that was discreet enough to erase all traces under the dim lights of Jackson that night. As the first few months passed with no trace of Serena appearing anywhere, the investigation gradually fell into a stalemate. The investigative team had swept routes, checked cameras, explored the possibility Serena left the area by vehicle, analyzed traces in the apartment, and interrogated Evan multiple times, but all they had gathered were scattered suspicions lacking the decisive piece to tie everything together. There was no body, no significant amount of blood, no direct physical evidence proving violence leading to death, and no witness who saw Serena being forced to leave the complex. Those factors left the case stalled right at the boundary of a conclusion without ever crossing it. In the following months, police continued receiving tips from residents in areas surrounding Jackson about women who resembled Serena or had familiar-looking gaits. Every tip was logged, analyzed, and, when necessary, the investigative team sent someone to verify in person. But not once did any of these leads result in Serena reappearing. Each case ended with the same answer. The person seen was not Serena Grant. The case therefore grew even heavier, as every direction pursued led to no progress at all. Years turned into years, and by 1997, Serena's disappearance was officially transferred to the state-level investigative unit, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or TBI. This was a standard step when a local case dragged on without signs of resolution. The TBI took over the entire file: interrogation transcripts, scene diagrams, forensic reports, route maps, and all witness statements. State-level investigators began reassessing the file with fresh eyes, hoping to spot details the local team might have overlooked. However, even approaching the file from a broader perspective, the TBI encountered the same difficulties. What they had was an apartment with signs of a scuffle whose timing was hard to pin down, a trace amount of blood that couldn't be analyzed with 1997 technology, and a chain of inconsistent statements from Evan. Everything hinted at the possibility Serena met with foul play right inside the apartment, but each trace lacked the connecting element needed to form a legally sound conclusion. The TBI re-examined every detail in Evan's statements and questioned him repeatedly during the early years after taking over the case. Yet Evan always maintained the same pattern of response: calm, evasive, saying little, neither denying nor admitting anything specific. The smoothness in maintaining his account made him a major bottleneck with no tool available to break it open. A few veteran TBI investigators noted personal observations in internal files. Evan was highly likely to be directly involved in Serena's disappearance, but there was no physical evidence. This assessment wasn't accusatory. It simply reflected behavioral analysis based on the file, but it also highlighted the impasse. Though everything they uncovered pointed toward Evan, they could do nothing more than continue distant monitoring and hope for new leads. In the years that followed, the TBI periodically reviewed the file, each time approaching it with the mindset that forensic technology might improve, or someone in the community might come forward with new information. But as time passed, people who once lived near the complex moved away. Memories faded, and the rumors about the disappearance grew quieter with each passing year. The door of hope for new leads therefore closed gradually. During this period, Serena's family never gave up. Every year, they sent requests for case updates to the Jackson Police and the TBI, sent Serena's photos to local newspapers, posted pleas on community bulletin boards, and stayed in touch with organizations supporting families of missing persons. They didn't abandon Serena, but their efforts weren't enough to create progress when the investigating agencies had no new data to analyze. They asked about progress, requested expanded searches, suggested checking new areas, but everything required investigative grounds, and nothing in the file provided a clear new direction. The answer was always the same. There is no new information. A sense of helplessness seeped into the entire case. No one could prove Serena was still alive, but no one could prove she was gone either. No one could prove Evan committed a crime, but no one could eliminate him from suspicion either. Repeated interrogations brought no new information. Rechecked areas showed no signs Serena had ever passed through. Old evidence couldn't be analyzed with the forensic techniques available at the time. Every element remained suspended in limbo. By the early 2000s, Serena's disappearance was officially moved to the cold case category per protocol, a file with no significant progress over a long period and no indication of additional relevant data emerging. The reclassification didn't mean the investigation was closed, but it meant the case no longer had a dedicated full-time investigative team. The file was archived in the TBI's data storage, to be reopened only with reasonable cause, but it no longer endured the flow of active investigation. Serena's family had to face the reality that the legal system couldn't go any further when all that remained was suspicion and an incomplete chain of traces. They continued asking, continued demanding justice, continued holding on to hope, but they also understood that no specific piece of evidence had surfaced. With each passing year, the void stretched longer, and Serena Grant's case drifted slowly into the shadows of unsolved files. The TBI Evidence Storage Facility undergoes periodic reorganization for inventory, according to new standards. A process that seems purely administrative, but sometimes yields unexpected discoveries. On one working morning, while a storage clerk was going through old file boxes to cross-check identification numbers against the electronic list, he paused in front of a cardboard box that had been placed out of alignment with the row. The label on the outside of the box had faded almost completely, leaving only a few faint characters, and it sat in the section designated for evidence related to traffic violations, an inappropriate location given the box's size and code. When he opened the box, he found a brown envelope with edges darkened by years of aging. The blue ink handwriting on the envelope revealed the case identifier, and though the writing had blurred, it was still recognizable as matching the file code for Serena Grant's missing person case. This immediately caught the clerk's attention. An evidence envelope related to a missing person case, sitting mixed in with an unrelated group of files, was extremely unusual. He checked the system and confirmed that this envelope was not listed in the official digitized evidence catalog from before. The envelope was taken to the supervised examination area for content review. Under bright lights, the wrinkled brown paper clearly showed old creases indicating the envelope had spent many years in an improper position. When opened, it contained two small bags, one holding a torn piece of fabric and the other containing a few strands of hair stuck together by a dried brown spot. Accompanying them was a short note sheet in the handwriting of the evidence collector from that time. The note stated that this sample had been collected from the area behind Evan Marshall's pickup truck in the early days of the case investigation. The description indicated that in 1996, the scene technician had observed a very small, darkened area on the rear floor mat of the truck and collected the sample for analysis when conditions allow. However, this note had never been transferred into the official case file, and the envelope had been misplaced during transport. It appeared the envelope had never reached the forensic lab. A labeling error, or mishandling during evidence transfer, had caused the envelope to be lost, sitting quietly in storage for nearly 2 decades without anyone noticing. The reappearance of the envelope caused quite a stir within the investigative team. Everyone recognized that any trace connected to Evan's vehicle, especially blood or torn material, carried far greater value than anything previously in the file. The case had always lacked a physical link tying Serena to any location beyond the apartment. Discovering a suspected blood sample inside Evan's truck could open possibilities that had previously remained at the level of speculation. The piece of fabric was placed under magnification. The fibers were cross-woven, frayed along one edge, creating an irregular tear mark. This indicated it had been pulled apart by force rather than cut or torn through natural wear. The note sheet simply described it as light-colored fabric, location, rear floor of truck. From the fiber shape to the edge fraying, everything suggested this torn piece did not come from a seat or the truck's carpet, but from clothing material or a bag. In the context of a disappearance with signs of a struggle, this detail was particularly significant. The remaining plastic bag contained about 3 long hair strands, clumped together by a dried brown spot. A quick protein test in the lab confirmed the spot contained blood components. Though the amount was small and couldn't be deeply analyzed with old technology, it remained a noteworthy indicator because hair stuck with blood could not naturally appear in the vehicle of someone uninjured or who had no contact with an injury. The note sheet confirmed the hair was collected from the same truck area. When reviewing the 1996 investigation data, investigators saw that Evan had asserted his truck was not used around the time Serena left the apartment. But if blood-stained hair was found in the truck, this opened the possibility that someone had been injured inside the vehicle, or that blood-contaminated material had been brought aboard. Given the case context, this made the truck a renewed focal point for re-examination despite having been set aside long ago. The cold case team handling the file took possession of the envelope and immediately sent the 2 samples to the state's modern forensic lab for evaluation under better conditions. With new equipment, analyzing DNA from a trace blood amount became feasible, something the 1996 team could not do. However, before discussing analysis possibilities, the most critical step was verifying the chain of custody remained intact. The note sheet inside the envelope clearly recorded the collection date and time, technician's name, collection location, and packaging type. Everything was intact, allowing the envelope to still be considered valid evidence. The unexpected emergence of the mislabeled envelope drew the entire investigative team's attention. They re-examined the full context of the sample collection, comparing it to Evan's statements and the unclear points in the timeline. The envelope's accidental loss had inadvertently kept the investigation stalled in a state of suspicion for many years, without a chance to get closer to answers. Though it couldn't yet be confirmed that the envelope's contents contained DNA to unravel the mystery of Serena, its value lay in being the first piece of evidence with the potential to link Serena's path to Evan's truck, a suspicion that had always lingered but never had physical backing. Investigators noted, this envelope, with the torn fabric and blood-stained hair strands, was very likely the missing link in the entire chain of events. There was no guarantee the contents held the key to solving everything, but it was the first evidence weighty enough to reopen questions long left hanging. And for a case that had stood still for so long, that possibility alone was enough to change the atmosphere in the investigation room entirely. After the lost evidence envelope was found and sent for analysis, the TBI continued reviewing the list of individuals who had been interviewed back in 1996 to see if any of them could be re-interviewed. During the file review, one name that had been listed at the bottom of the witness list surfaced. This was an old acquaintance of Serena's from her high school friend group, someone the police at the time had only questioned briefly because she said it had been a long time since she'd seen Serena. When contacted again in 2004, this witness unexpectedly provided new information. According to her, Serena had once told a few friends that she wanted to leave Jackson to start a new life somewhere else. This detail immediately caught the attention of several investigators because it aligned with the story Evan had mentioned, that Serena intended to leave town because it felt too suffocating and she wanted a change of environment. If the witness's account was accurate, it could shift the entire approach to the case. It opened the possibility that Serena had left voluntarily, or at least left without telling her family. As a result, the TBI spent time rechecking documents related to financial activity, bank records, credit card statements, old emails, correspondence, and any trace Serena might have left if she had truly planned to go far away. However, the data obtained did not support this hypothesis. Serena's bank account showed no significant transactions after the night she disappeared. Her credit card was never swiped. Her savings account was barely touched. There was no evidence Serena had booked a hotel, bought bus tickets, plane tickets, or contacted anyone outside Jackson around the time of her disappearance. She had no new loans, no unusual cash withdrawals, and no actions indicating she was preparing to change her life. This made the leaving Jackson hypothesis difficult to sustain. Even so, the detail provided by the witness still inevitably pulled the investigation in a distracting direction. The TBI spent considerable time verifying whether Serena had ever mentioned wanting to leave town to anyone else. They reached out to co-workers at the store where she worked, people who had gone to school with her, and even friends who had moved to other states. No one confirmed that Serena had ever talked about leaving Jackson to start over. Some even said she was planning to enroll in new vocational classes, which was completely contrary to the idea of leaving. The investigators involved in the case documented the witness's statement, but also noted that the information was not specific. The person recounting it didn't remember exactly when Serena said it, didn't recall the circumstances, and didn't remember who else was listening. Pieces of information like that, in a serious missing person case, carried almost no evidentiary value. However, the fact that it matched Evan's story made some team members question whether Serena might have left after a heated argument. While the group analyzing evidence from the envelope continued their work, another group pursued the voluntary departure angle, checking nearby towns, contacting women's shelters or facilities for people under family pressure, and sending Serena's description to hospitals and clinics. No place reported a match for Serena. No one matched the information, and no one reached out saying they had encountered a woman resembling Serena. Gradually, as each hypothesis related to Serena leaving on her own was ruled out, investigators returned to the reality they had faced from the beginning. There was no evidence showing Serena was still alive after that night. No cameras, no financial transactions, no correspondence, no phone activity, not a single sign that she had continued her life elsewhere. The prolonged silence across all data made the theory of Serena going somewhere on her own an unsustainable investigative direction. The witness who had provided the leaving Jackson information also couldn't supply any further details. When asked again, she admitted that Serena's comment might have been heard in a general context, not as a real plan. She only recalled Serena mentioning a couple of times that she wanted to escape the stress, but she didn't remember Serena saying where she would go or when she would leave. The TBI recorded the statement but couldn't treat it as grounds to expand the investigation in another direction. Not long after, the investigation returned to its previous state. The files still centered on suspicions about Evan, the signs of a scuffle in the apartment, the trace blood, and Serena's never-clarified path after she stepped out of the Woods Creek Apartments gate. No new evidence was added to break the deadlock, and peripheral information like the witness's statement wasn't strong enough to create a shift. When the evidence from the envelope had not yet yielded clear results, the TBI was forced to reclassify the case as a cold case once again. The file was closed, but not forgotten. It was placed alongside other unsolved cases files waiting for something new to emerge. Whether better forensic technology, an unexpected statement, or a piece of evidence once overlooked, like the envelope found in storage, Serena's family continued to reach out, continued to ask, continued to hope, but as of 2004, the law could do nothing more than archive the file, retain all the information gathered, and wait. Serena Grant's disappearance, once again, sank into the silence of stalled files not because of a lack of effort, but because of the absence of a truth no one had yet been able to grasp. When the file continued to fall into a state of stagnation, the TBI decided to invite an FBI criminal psychologist to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of all existing data, not to deliver a final conclusion, but to see whether the behavioral characteristics in Serena's disappearance fit a studied criminal pattern. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began by reviewing the full context of the argument inside the apartment, the extent of the disarray, the tone neighbors heard, the trace amount of blood, Evan's inconsistent statements, and the sequence leading to Serena stepping out the door in a clearly unstable state. The experts assessed that the behavioral pattern in this case showed many signs consistent with a rage killing, a spontaneous outburst that typically occurs in a familiar environment, between people in a close relationship, and stems from feelings of threat or insult. This type of crime is unplanned, often erupting in a moment of overwhelming tension that causes the perpetrator to lose control. In Serena's file, the matching elements included a major conflict occurring in their own home, prolonged shouting, objects being slammed or thrown, and a small blood spot appearing in a location where strong impact could have happened. These factors suggested the incident did not arise from premeditated behavior but from an emotional state exceeding one of the two people's breaking point. In addition, the FBI analyzed that if Serena had said something that wounded or challenged the man she lived with, his role, ego, or psychological power, a common trigger in rage killings, then this could have sparked sudden violent behavior. Though no one knew the content of the argument, the volume level and the disarray in the apartment indicated it was far more than minor disagreement. When combined with Serena leaving the home in a panicked state, the analysts concluded the conflict had reached a breaking point. In the behavioral model of this crime type, the perpetrator is often unusually calm afterward, as a form of psychological defense to mask inner panic. Evan's demeanor during interrogation fit this pattern. Flat attitude, avoidance of eye contact, few questions about the missing person, no display of conflicting emotions. Particularly, in many rage-killing cases, the perpetrator tends to downplay the intensity of the conflict or deny any violent element in retelling the event, which matched Evan's statements when he repeatedly described it as just a normal argument, despite neighbors clearly hearing shouting. Another detail that sharpened the behavioral fit was Evan's attempt to construct an image of Serena wanting to leave Jackson. This is a common trait in the psychology of perpetrators after a violent conflict, creating an alternative narrative to explain the disappearance, thereby weakening the criminal act hypothesis. The FBI noted that Evan's persistent argument in this direction, despite no supporting evidence, could be an instinctive cover-up effort rather than a long-term plan. In the report the FBI sent back to the TBI, one analytical section emphasized that the details of the disappearance, the timing, location, closeness of the relationship, reactive behavior patterns, disturbance in a private space all aligned with the model of a perpetrator who knew the victim intimately. Disappearances caused by strangers rarely occur without signs of forced entry or obvious violence at the scene. In Serena's case, the apartment showed no signs of break-in, the locks remained intact, and every indicator appeared only inside the space used solely by Serena and Evan. Nevertheless, the FBI also had to stress that behavioral profiling holds only analytical value and cannot serve as evidence for prosecution. They listed a high likelihood that the perpetrator was the person closest to the victim, but due to the lack of forensic traces, this conclusion could only be placed in the observations section. In the file, the report clearly stated, insufficient physical evidence to link behavior to criminal action. This also reflected the reality of many disappearances occurring in private spaces. The behavioral pattern may be partially or fully accurate, but cannot lead to legal action. TBI investigators read the report over many hours, underlining sections describing matches with Evan's behavior. The emotionless calm, the evasion, the inconsistent statements, the narrative steering towards Serena leaving on her own, and the lack of genuine cooperation. One investigator wrote in the final comments section, behavioral pattern assessment shows high fit with an inside suspect. Evan Marshall remains the primary suspect based on behavioral factors. However, Serena's file still lacked strong enough physical evidence to move into a formal criminal investigation. The case continued to rely on behavioral analysis, statements, contradictions, and scene inferences, all painting a picture pointing in one direction, but providing no tool to take the decisive next step. Within the investigative framework at the time, both the behavior and the investigator's instincts indicated that the events of that night between Serena and Evan went beyond a normal argument. But when the law demands clear physical proof, they were forced to file this conclusion as a key observation without being able to act on it. The file was then returned to the cold case drawer, along with the latest behavioral analysis report. The focus of suspicion remained unchanged, only carrying a heavier weight because little more could be done. In the investigative team's notes, one line was circled: Evan remains the primary suspect. While the file continued to remain in a state of stagnation, the TBI decided to expand the scope of review to indirect data sources that had been recorded but never analyzed under current standards. One of those sources was a series of Landsat satellite images collected in 1996, documents that had previously only been glanced at superficially due to their coarse resolution and lack of suitable analysis tools. The TBI's image processing team now used modern software to see if any additional details could be extracted about the area around Woods Creek Apartments, especially the open land areas that could be accessed at night. When the image layers were processed and compared across time markers, one area located behind the apartment complex adjacent to the plot of land Evan had once rented for storage suddenly became noteworthy. On the May 1996 map, the ground surface in that area appeared fairly uniform, with no signs of disturbance. But in the June image, a few weeks after Serena disappeared, a patch of land showed a different tone, lighter, rougher, and reflecting light, in a way the experts described as recently disturbed. Soil moisture analysis data indicated this patch had been dug up and then refilled in a short period. Although satellite imagery could not determine the exact scale or depth of the digging, the clear before and after change caused the area to be flagged immediately. The analysis team continued zooming in on the area using contrast enhancement algorithms, and they noticed the shape of the patch was unnatural. The edges were squarer than typical erosion would produce, and the surface was flatter than the surrounding ground as if lightly leveled. The patch's location sat right at the edge of the land Evan had rented to store unused items. Lease contracts in the file confirmed Evan had access rights to this area and often parked his pickup truck there when moving things. The investigator assigned to the file realized this plot had never been searched. In the early stages of the investigation, focus had been on the apartment and the front area of Woods Creek Apartments, while the rear land was not considered, because no information at the time pointed to its relevance. Back then, sweeping a large open lot without specific leads was deemed impractical and resource wasting, especially with no witness reports or physical evidence linking the area to Serena. The discovery of the patch through satellite imagery changed that perception instantly. After marking the location, the investigative team went to the site for visual inspection. By 2004, the ground surface had changed significantly from 1996 due to weather, vegetation, and irregular use of the land. However, soil experts could still identify very faint ripples in the soil color, something commonly seen at sites of past human intervention. The surface hardness also differed slightly from surrounding areas due to recompaction. Though the eye could not confirm the soil had been dug, the region still showed signals consistent with the satellite data, allowing the TBI to decide on deeper examination. Investigators re-examined the timeline. The soil patch changed during the exact period Serena vanished. The area was under Evan's control, and no search had ever targeted it. This chain of factors was strong enough to place the land on the case's high-priority checkpoints list. Adding this point was not a concluding step, but it created a new direction in a case stalled for many years. The investigation map was updated, with the area marked in red. The team conducted on-site measurements to determine the precise size of the suspected area, recording terrain influences and vehicle access potential. This was important because if a pickup truck could easily enter, it fully aligned with the hypothesis that someone could have moved a heavy object or a body at night without nearby residents noticing. One team member also reviewed Evan's land lease records to determine whether anyone besides him had permission to access the area. The contract showed Evan was the only person with usage rights throughout the time of the disappearance. No workers, no sublessees, no notes about sharing the land with others. This made the detail about the soil patch even more significant. Every time the investigative team cross-referenced this new information with Evan's behavioral data, the overlaps became harder to ignore. Someone intimately connected to Serena, a history of conflict, behavioral patterns matching the rage-killing model, possession of a vehicle capable of transporting a person, and access to a secluded plot of land. The existence of a dug and refilled patch, right at the time of disappearance, caused all these elements to converge at a level never seen before. However, to reach any legal conclusion, investigators needed direct verification of the area. Though time had altered the patch, there remained the possibility that evidence could be preserved beneath the surface, especially metal, personal items, or fabric fibers. The search could not rely on speculation. It required combining ground-penetrating tools, electrical conductivity measurements, and layered manual excavation methods. As soon as the information was confirmed, investigators noted the area into the priority list. The plot of land behind Woods Creek Apartments, once overlooked because no connection was apparent, now emerged as a central position, needing excavation. This was not proof, but it was the strongest lead to appear since Serena vanished. And for a case that had dragged on for many years, having one specific point to focus the search on was exactly what the investigative team had waited for so long. When the mislabeled evidence envelope was found and sent to the forensic lab, the technicians immediately placed the samples on the priority analysis list under current technological standards. Extracting DNA from trace amounts of blood had been nearly impossible in the late 1990s, but new generation analyzers now allowed information to be extracted from even extremely small, degraded samples over time. Therefore, the torn piece of fabric and the hair strands stuck with the brown spot became the central focus of the entire reevaluation of Serena Grant's file. The technicians began by separating the stained portion on the fabric, using a refined sample purification process to remove dust and contaminants that had accumulated over many years. The microscopic portion containing hemoglobin was fed into a low-quantity DNA analyzer. In a completely sterile environment, even a few micrograms of biological material could be decoded. When the machine ran for the first time, no one dared to expect too much, because the sample was so old and had not been stored under specialized conditions for decades. But the initial analysis results showed that the DNA sequence in the sample still existed sufficiently to continue processing. Each gene segment was reconstructed in the automated analysis system, and when the results appeared, the lab sent an urgent notification to the cold case investigator in charge. The DNA sequence obtained from the trace blood matched Serena Grant's biological profile in the missing persons database. The match was near absolute. There was no possibility this match occurred by chance. That meant Serena's blood had once been present in the bed of Evan Marshall's pickup truck around the time she disappeared. This was the first time in the entire case that physical evidence linked Serena to a location outside the apartment. Before this, all data had stopped at descriptions and speculation. Mismatched statements, unusual behavior, conflict inside the home, gaps in camera footage. But the absence of a sample confirming that Serena had been injured and that she had been in an abnormal situation had prevented all suspicions from connecting into a legal argument. With the new DNA discovery, that boundary was broken. The investigator received the official report late in the afternoon. Under the conclusions section, the lab clearly stated, DNA extracted from related evidence matches that of Serena Grant. Accuracy level permits identification conclusion. Those lines changed the entire focus of the case. From a suspicious missing person file, the matter shifted to a group involving suspected violent behavior. A formal declaration of death could not be made without a body, but evidence of blood in the vehicle of the person who had direct conflict with Serena indicated she had been in a seriously dangerous situation before or during the time of her disappearance. When cross-referencing the location of the blood spot in the rear bed of the pickup truck, investigators assessed that this was not a natural position for someone's blood to appear unless there had been forced movement or a violent situation. The rear bed of a truck was not a place where Serena or any passenger would have a reasonable reason to sit. If she had suffered a minor accidental injury for some other reason, Evan could have explained it at the time the truck was checked. But Evan had never mentioned Serena being injured in the truck, and the piece of fabric did not match any item in the vehicle. These two details created an absolute contradiction between his statements and the physical evidence. The investigative team concluded that the fabric piece was likely torn during a struggle or transport, and the blood-stained hair strands were the result of injury. This was not the image of someone leaving home to start a new life. It was the image of someone who had suffered violent impact. At the moment the evidence piece was confirmed, the case crossed a new threshold. Investigators no longer viewed this as a simple disappearance. They shifted direction to evaluate the entire file under the standard for homicide, without a body, a difficult but fully fitting form of investigation with the new data. In internal documents, investigators noted that this evidence placed Serena at a location where she had no natural reason to be. No other hypothesis was as convincing as the one that she had been taken into Evan's pickup truck against her will. The FBI behavioral analysts had previously emphasized that spontaneous conflicts in close relationships often lead to concealment or disposal behavior using personal vehicles. When the DNA evidence sat right inside that vehicle, this hypothesis was reinforced to the point of becoming critical. In addition to the DNA results, investigators also paid attention to the match between two factors: the dug and refilled soil patch discovered through satellite imagery and Evan's right to use that land. When combined with the blood evidence in the truck, a new logical chain formed. If Serena's blood appeared in the truck, and if there was a dug patch right at the time of her disappearance in an area Evan controlled, then these two elements could be directly related. This was not enough to charge, but it was enough to set the primary focus. From the moment the DNA results were confirmed, Evan Marshall was no longer just a suspect based on behavior. He became the official primary suspect in the case. Investigators recorded this in the file. Evan Marshall, primary suspect due to forensic link. This was a distinctly different step, because for the first time, suspicion was not only based on inconsistent statements or behavioral patterns, but on irrefutable physical evidence. The forensic report ended with a short line: "Results hold legal value." This meant the evidence had passed the chain of custody, showed no signs of contamination, and could fully be entered into prosecutorial records when needed. For a case that had stretched over many years, this was the most important turning point since Serena stepped out of the Woods Creek Apartments gate that night and vanished completely. After the DNA results confirmed that the blood on the fabric piece belonged to Serena, the investigators immediately reviewed all assets and vehicles that Evan had owned during the period she disappeared. The records showed that Evan's old pickup truck, the vehicle that had been preliminarily inspected in 1996, had been sold by him to a scrapyard a few years later. Even though the truck was no longer in use and had gone through multiple stages of dismantling, the TBI still decided to determine whether it still existed. By tracing the scrapyard's paperwork and ledgers, they discovered that the truck had not been completely crushed for recycling, but had been kept because some components were still saleable individually. This created an opportunity to access the vehicle from which the original evidence had been collected. When the investigators arrived at the scrapyard, they found the truck sitting at the edge of the storage area, its silver paint faded, one door removed, and many interior parts no longer intact. Nevertheless, the cabin and the rear bed still retained enough structure to serve forensic examination purposes. The scrapyard employee confirmed that the truck had been there for many years and had rarely been touched except for the removal of a few mechanical parts. That reduced the chance of new contamination to the evidence, a critical factor in the forensic inspection process. The forensic team began their work by photographing the entire vehicle and marking positions for detailed inspection. They used ultraviolet lights and reactive solutions to check for traces of fluids that had once been present on the surfaces. On the rear bed, where the fabric piece and hair had been collected, several faint parallel streaks appeared like swipe marks. When illuminated with special lighting, those streaks became more visible, indicating they could be remnants of a strong cleaning solution. These streaks did not appear naturally and had a uniform pattern as if someone had repeatedly scrubbed the surface hard with a stiff brush. Beyond the rear bed, forensics also examined the area between the front seats and the rear seat. In the metal section beneath the old carpet where it was not easily visible to the naked eye, they discovered a long, grayish-silver strip, darker than the surrounding metal. This strip had the characteristic appearance of a surface that had contacted an oxidizing cleaning agent. When samples were taken and analyzed, the results showed traces of sodium hypochlorite, a common component in many strong bleaching solutions. If someone wanted to remove blood or biological traces from the truck, this type of chemical was frequently used. Several bolts and other metal edges in the truck bed also showed signs of being scrubbed. The metal at a few spots was lightly worn, forming unnatural curves that matched the pattern of abrasion from vigorous brushing with a wire brush. These signs suggested that around the time of the disappearance, there had been an effort to clean the truck at a level far deeper than routine maintenance. The technicians noted that these signs could not have been created by people dismantling the truck at the scrapyard, because the wear patterns and corrosion levels had existed before the truck arrived there. The scrapyard employee also confirmed they had not applied any strong cleaning agents to the vehicle. When cross-referencing the wear marks and chemical residues with the location where Serena's blood was found, investigators noted a high degree of correspondence. The scrubbing marks concentrated exactly in the suspicious areas, the rear bed and the space between the seats, and did not spread across the entire cabin, as normal cleaning behavior would. This focused pattern indicated a deliberate action targeting specific points, likely places where blood or biological traces had once been and needed to be erased. The presence of strong cleaning agent residues, combined with the metal scrubbing marks, painted a clear picture. There had been an effort to clean the truck to remove traces related to Serena. Investigators, upon reviewing the forensic report, recorded in the file that the level of manual intervention to erase traces had a clear, purposeful intent. The method of removing traces was not the result of spills or ordinary cleanup, but showed signs of evidence elimination behavior. In the context of the case, the person with the highest motive and opportunity to carry out this action remained Evan Marshall. The DNA evidence had already shown that Serena's blood had once been in his truck, and now forensics indicated that the truck had been cleaned using methods commonly employed to erase biological evidence. The investigative team could not treat this as conclusive proof, but it strongly reinforced the argument that Evan was directly involved in the circumstances causing Serena's disappearance. In internal discussions, they assessed this cleaning behavior as an element consistent with the prior behavioral model. Unusual calmness, illogical story about Serena wanting to leave Jackson, evasion when describing the level of conflict, and the fact that he never mentioned the truck as a possible relevant factor. The disjointed points in his statements were now connected by forensic evidence. After receiving the complete forensic report, investigators noted that the level of suspicion toward Evan needed to be elevated. Expanded surveillance of him was considered not with immediate intent to arrest, but because each new piece of evidence seemed to reinforce the direction of suspicion that had existed from the beginning. Local police coordinated with the TBI to monitor Evan's activities, noting interactions, unusual behavior, and any attempts he might make to avoid questioning or leave the area. The re-examination of the pickup truck, a vehicle that had seemed to have no further investigative value, became a crucial link. In the context of a file that had stretched over many years, every new trace, even the smallest, carried weight. And at this point, the truck had provided something the previous years had never had: clear signs of unnatural cleaning activity that aligned precisely with the time Serena disappeared. This was the element that turned suspicion toward Evan from intuition or behavioral analysis into the realm of provable forensics. When the forensic results from Evan's pickup truck were entered into the file, the investigators continued reviewing the list of individuals who had appeared in the preliminary interview rounds in 1996 but had not played a central role. One name stood out: Mark Delaney, a casual acquaintance of Evan's, who had worked with him at an equipment repair shop around the time of Serena's disappearance. Mark had been briefly interviewed that year, but his statement at the time provided nothing noteworthy, only stating that he had not seen Evan on the day Serena vanished. When investigators reached out again to ask follow-up questions, Mark hesitated before agreeing to meet. The conversation took place in a small interview room at the local police station. Mark appeared tense, hands clasped together and eyes constantly avoiding contact. When asked why he agreed to meet this time, Mark sighed and said he had been thinking about it for many years but had never found the courage to speak up. The appearance of the investigators and the questions that brought the past back made it impossible for him to remain silent any longer. Mark began recounting that on the night Serena disappeared, Evan had come to his house near midnight. Evan said he needed help moving something heavy onto his pickup truck and begged Mark to assist for just a few minutes. According to Mark, Evan looked extremely agitated, constantly glancing around as if afraid someone was watching. When Mark asked what was so heavy that it needed help, Evan didn't answer and only urged, "Come with me for a bit. It'll be quick." Not wanting to argue, and because they had worked together, Mark agreed to follow Evan to the plot of land Evan rented behind Woods Creek Apartments, the exact location flagged in the satellite images for the dug and refilled patch. When they arrived, Mark described Evan pushing a long object wrapped in a dark-colored cloth. He couldn't clearly see what it was, but he thought it was too bulky to be just household items or scrap. It was heavy enough that Evan could barely lift it alone. Mark helped Evan carry the object into the bed of the pickup truck. What haunted Mark for many years was Evan's reaction. His face pale, breathing ragged, hands shaking so badly he had to grip the side of the truck for a moment. When Mark asked if Evan was in any trouble, Evan only replied, "I have to deal with this right now. Don't ask any more." Mark's account aligned perfectly with the time Serena was last seen. When investigators asked why he hadn't said this back in 1996, he bowed his head in silence for a long moment. Mark admitted he was too afraid of getting implicated because Evan had been angry, agitated, and emotionally out of control at the time. He didn't know what was wrapped in the cloth, but the fear of being seen as an accomplice or connected to something he didn't fully understand made him choose silence. Mark added that back then he didn't think Serena had met with anything serious. He just thought Evan was in some personal trouble and needed help cleaning up something. Only weeks later, when he read about Serena's disappearance in the news, did Mark realize the terrifying coincidence between the timing and Evan's behavior. But by then, public attention had shifted to various other theories, and Mark grew even more afraid that his statement would at least put him at legal risk he didn't dare take on. During the interview, Mark still showed lingering guilt. He said the more time passed, the heavier the memory weighed on him, especially knowing the case hadn't progressed, but fear had kept him avoiding it. Only when he heard from the investigators that new evidence had surfaced, did Mark believe staying silent was no longer reasonable, so he decided to speak. The investigators recorded this statement with the highest caution. They could not overlook the details Mark described. Evan trembling, voice choked, panicked. Demeanor behaviors rarely seen in someone just moving scrap. The fact that Evan asked for help on the very night Serena disappeared, at the exact plot where satellite images showed unusual soil change, created a continuous chain connecting to the forensic evidence already obtained. Serena's blood in the truck, strong cleaning agent residues, and questionable points in Evan's statements. What Mark described about the long-wrapped object also drew the investigative team's attention. The shape of the wrapped item, the way Evan struggled to lift it, and his hurried actions matched the possibility that Evan was trying to conceal something far larger than an ordinary object. Mark said he saw no blood, no hands or feet exposed, but he had always been haunted by the feeling that the object was not an item. That feeling, though it could not serve as direct evidence, strongly reinforced the meaning of the statement. Evan was hiding something he didn't want anyone to know. At the end of the interview, Mark emphasized that he did not want to be involved in anything related to Evan. He only wanted to free himself from carrying a heavy secret for so long. The investigators fully documented the statement and asked Mark to sign confirmation, ensuring all information was recorded accurately. Mark's statement was immediately cross-checked against the timeline. Serena vanished that night. Evan had no alibi. The pickup truck showed cleaning marks. The land was dug at the right time. And now, a witness saw Evan moving a heavy object in the same time frame. Everything fit together like scattered pieces finally being assembled. Although this statement could not be treated as conclusive proof, it carried significant value in terms of timeline, structure, and behavior, helping investigators better understand what might have happened after Serena left the apartment. More importantly, this statement broke the long-standing gap in the timeline, the gap that had kept the case shrouded in shadow for nearly 3 decades. As Mark left the interview room, the investigators returned to the file, marking Evan's plot of land, the clean truck, and the moment Evan asked Mark for help as the 3 heaviest elements in the chain of suspicion. After Mark Delaney's statement, the plot of land that Evan had once rented behind Woods Creek Apartments was identified as the central point requiring excavation. The suspicions that had lingered for many years now converged at this location. The dug and refilled soil patch, identified through satellite imagery, Evan's presence there on the night Serena disappeared according to his statement, and Mark's description of lifting a heavy object onto the pickup truck. The investigative team coordinated with geologists and forensic specialists, bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment to the site to scan the surface. The GPR was set up to scan in wide strips of land, creating a map of reflected waves that revealed any unusual objects or voids beneath the original soil layer. Just a few minutes into the preliminary scan, the screen displayed strong reflection points in curved patterns, indicating the presence of plastic bags or man-made materials at a depth of about 60 to 90 centimeters. These anomalies did not appear uniformly but in clusters, spaced a few meters apart, a characteristic inconsistent with household trash, burial, and more suggestive of intentional concealment. Investigators marked the positions where the GPR showed strong returns, then authorized the excavation team to open each point. The top layer of soil was noticeably softer than the surrounding areas, consistent with ground that had been dug up and refilled. About 30 minutes later, the digging crew struck a layer of black material. A large, tightly compacted trash bag emerged just below the damp soil. The bag was partially decomposed but still held its shape thanks to multiple nylon layers. When the bag was brought to the surface and opened inside the examination tent, a musty, metallic odor wafted out. Inside were women's clothing, folded in layers, a light-colored t-shirt, and a pair of jeans torn at one knee. The items matched the description in Serena Grant's missing person file. Investigators clenched their fists as the t-shirt was gently shaken out under the light. The collar and sleeves showed dark brown stains that had soaked deeply into the fabric fibers. Forensics used a quick hemoglobin reaction swab, and the result confirmed human blood. The bloodstains were irregular and smeared, indicating they had fallen during movement or dragging rather than from a small wound. The clothing also displayed several horizontal tears with frayed fiber edges, suggesting the rips occurred during a struggle rather than from snagging on objects. In the second bag, unearthed at the fourth GPR-marked point, the digging team discovered a nearly 1 meter long black electrical cord with intact copper core inside. One end was wrapped tightly with duct tape, apparently to create a secure binding point. Forensics analyzed the cord and noted numerous small parallel scratches on the outer surface marks commonly seen when a cord is tightened or pulled hard around skin or a soft object. Although it could not yet be concluded that the cord was used to restrain a person, the signs on the cord were fully consistent with use in a coercive situation. The remaining trash bags contained mixed household waste and insignificant debris, but their presence buried in clusters at the same depth from the same source indicated the burial was not random or the result of someone dumping garbage. Some bags even showed knife cut marks, as if the person burying them wanted to remove air so the bags would not swell under the soil. This demonstrated a high degree of intent in the concealment. Investigators sought an answer to the biggest question: could Serena's body possibly be found here? After excavating all the GPR-marked areas, they found no human bones, no soft tissue, no biological material beyond the clothing and blood. Forensic experts assessed that if a body had once been buried here, traces of decomposition, bodily fluids, or bone fragments would likely remain even after the passage of time. The complete absence of any human remains led investigators to suspect that Serena's body may have been buried at this location initially but was later moved elsewhere. Analysis of the clothing noted that the blood had soaked deeply into the fibers, and the drying pattern matched the timeline of Serena's disappearance. Dried blood samples were scraped and submitted for DNA analysis. The results matched Serena's profile. This was the second time Serena's DNA appeared in physical evidence, this time on clothing she had worn. There was no longer any doubt that Serena had suffered serious injury on the night she vanished. Forensics also recorded soil residues on the clothing that matched the soil composition of this area, an indicator that the clothing had been present at the site at or after the time of the incident. By comparing the layering of the bags and the degree of decomposition, experts estimated that the trash bags had been buried very close to the date of Serena's disappearance, not old garbage that had been there for years beforehand. Investigators compiled all the data and wrote an internal summary report. The plot of land showed digging and refilling immediately after Serena's disappearance. Trash bags contained her blood-stained clothing, a suspected binding cord, all located in an area Evan alone had access to in 1996. The combination of these elements was no longer a scattered chain of suspicions, but a clear, logical structure. Serena was highly likely attacked, placed in Evan's truck, and her clothing disposed of at this plot before her body was moved to another location. As soon as the forensic report reached the prosecutor's office, they noted that the file had surpassed the level of high suspicion and was entering the realm of probable cause to consider an arrest warrant. Although no body had been found, the presence of blood, Serena's clothing, a suspected binding item, and signs of deliberate concealment, all directly linked to Evan, created a stronger legal foundation than at any previous point in the case. The excavation of the plot did not yield a body, but for the first time it exposed physical traces that could not be explained innocently. And those traces were powerful enough to elevate the case from a long-standing missing person file to a full-weight criminal homicide investigation. While the investigative team expanded the scope of reviewing data related to the case, a technician in the audio archive room accidentally discovered a 911 recording file sitting in a folder that did not match any official classification. The file belonged to analog data storage that had been digitized in the late 2000s, but it had been misassigned to the group line noise, unidentified source, causing it to never be entered into the file of any case. When the technician clicked to open the recording, just the first few seconds made him stop and immediately report it to his superiors. The recording began with the rapid, panicked breathing of a woman, accompanied by the sound of heavy objects crashing. A female voice emerged, trembling and broken as if struggling to speak amid terror. The audio was mixed with interference, making it hard to distinguish every word, but the content was clear enough to convey absolute desperation. "Please, help. Please, he." Before the sentence could finish, a loud shout erupted, a male voice full of rage that completely drowned out the woman's sound. Right after the shout came a heavy impact, like a body being slammed against a wall or an object shattering. The recording lasted only 14 seconds before the line cut off abruptly, but every second carried the signature of violence inside the apartment, something Evan's statements had never admitted. When the technician compared the call time, the data log showed it had been recorded on the night Serena disappeared, within the same window when neighbors heard loud arguing. This was the very 911 call that witnesses had vaguely mentioned during the first interviews in 1996. They had heard someone sounding like Serena scream, but weren't certain because the arguing voices overlapped. That night, dispatch had received the call but couldn't pinpoint the location due to signal interference, and in the report at the time, it was classified as unidentified call, no callback possible. With current technology, the technicians ran the recording through an AI noise reduction system to reconstruct the audio. From the choppy static, the female voice became much clearer. The broken phrases started to emerge with remarkable sharpness. When the software enhanced the quality, one nearly complete sentence appeared: don't hit me." Immediately after came a hard thud against a solid surface, followed by the male voice, "Shut up." The similarity between this shout and the neighbors' descriptions of the sounds that night prompted the investigative team to immediately submit the recording for voice analysis. The Voice Analysis Center used voice samples collected from Evan's previous interrogations. The software compared pitch, rhythm, frequency, pronunciation, habits, and timbre. The analysis took many hours, and when the match table appeared, the similarity rate exceeded the standard threshold. Forensic technology showed that the male voice in the shout was almost certainly Evan Marshall's, reaching over 90% match, sufficient to be considered a significant indicator in the investigation. Investigators reviewed the file and cross-checked the timing. Serena left the apartment in a panicked state. Neighbors heard screaming and crashing objects. The 911 call was logged in the same time frame, and now the audio captured her pleading for help while a male voice shouted over her. If this call had been properly located and processed in 1996, the case could have taken a different direction from the start. But because location technology didn't exist at the time, and the recording was misclassified, it passed as meaningless noise. Now, listening to every second again, The investigators had no remaining doubt about the nature of that night. Serena did not leave the apartment purely out of anger as Evan had described. She called for help. She was silenced. And she faced violence before running out the door. This aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence. Blood in the truck, metal cleaning marks, blood-stained clothing, suspected binding cord, and the dug and refilled soil patch. The 911 call also explained why Serena left the apartment without any personal items. In domestic violence situations, especially when the perpetrator is someone close, victims often flee the scene, thinking only of escape, unprepared, and carrying nothing. This matched the neighbor's description. Serena left trembling, breathing hard, without a purse or phone. When the investigative team listened to the recording a second time, they focused on the background sounds. There was the noise of something striking a wooden surface, possibly a table or cabinet, and Serena's gasping cut short after the impact. After the shout, "Shut up," Serena's voice was no longer heard. That audio silence lasted a few seconds before the call ended. The cutoff timing aligned with neighbors' accounts of the arguing suddenly stopping. This was the element that led investigators to conclude violent behavior occurred right before Serena stepped out the door in an exhausted state, explaining why she couldn't run far or resist if pursued afterward. The prosecutor's office, upon receiving the recording, immediately added it to the timeline as one of the strongest pieces of evidence showing violence before Serena vanished. In their summary, investigators wrote that the recording shows Serena did not leave the apartment of her own free will, but under immediate danger. Based on the AI voice analysis, the male voice in the call was placed in the high-probability match category, with Evan, an element prosecutors evaluated as crucial to supporting the argument of an assault occurring before the victim left the home. At the end of the analysis session, the investigative team stood before a truth clearer than at any previous stage of the case. Right before Serena disappeared, violent conflict had occurred inside the apartment, captured by her own 911 plea for help. The call was cut off when the male voice overpowered hers. And that man, according to voice analysis, was Evan Marshall. After all, the new evidence was entered into the file: Serena's DNA in Evan's pickup truck, blood-stained clothing buried on the land Evan rented, the electrical cord showing signs of restraint, the dug and refilled soil patch coinciding with the time of Serena's disappearance, the cleaning behavior to erase traces in the truck, Mark Delaney's statement about the heavy object Evan wanted to dispose of, along with the restored 911 recording containing Serena's pleas for help and a male voice matching Evan. The TBI proceeded to compile the data according to legal standards to assess whether there was sufficient probable cause for an arrest warrant. The file, hundreds of pages long, was reviewed detail by detail one final time. Every piece fit into a clear timeline structure, not scattered. Conflict inside the apartment, signs of violence, Serena's blood in the truck, trace erasure marks, blood-stained clothing, the burial site for evidence, and a witness confirming Evan moved a heavy object that very night. No element stood alone, all connected in a consistent logical chain. The Tennessee State Prosecutor's Office reviewed the file and concluded there was probable cause, reasonable grounds under the legal standard, to request an arrest warrant for Evan Marshall on the charge of killing Serena Grant. The arrest warrant application was presented to the Madison County judge. The affidavit clearly described each category: forensic evidence, new witness statements, suspicion of evidence tampering, satellite data indicating soil disturbance at the plot, and the 911 call, revealing Serena's cries for help. The judge reviewed the file, cross-checked legal standards, and signed approval. From that moment, Evan Marshall was no longer merely a suspect. He held the official status of a suspect in a state-level criminal case. The TBI immediately deployed a special task force in coordination with Jackson Police. Evan had been under surveillance for several days prior to the warrant's issuance to ensure no flight risk. When the timing was confirmed, the task force moved to the residential area where Evan lived. They parked a few houses away to avoid drawing attention, using quiet approach tactics in line with safety protocols for suspects potentially linked to violent behavior. Evan stepped out of his house around 6:40 a.m., holding car keys and a small bag. He did not notice the investigators until two officers approached, clearly announcing the arrest warrant and ordering him to stand still. Evan stopped, offering no resistance. His face stiffened as the handcuffs were applied to his wrists, but he made no protest or questions. Silence continued from the reading of his Miranda rights through his placement in the patrol car. At the TBI headquarters in Jackson, Evan was taken to the interrogation room designated for homicide suspects. The full procedure was followed, video and audio recording, with a legal monitor present. As investigators began presenting the evidence from DNA results to Mark's statement, from blood-stained clothing to the 911 recording, Evan showed very little change in expression. He only stared down at the table, hands clenched tightly. There was no strong denial, no sign of panic, just prolonged silence. Investigators asked about the blood in the truck. Evan did not answer. When questioned about the reason for burying the clothing on the plot, he gave no response. When the 911 recording was played for him, Evan narrowed his eyes, but still said nothing. Investigators noted in the report that the prolonged silence is viewed as a typical avoidance response in cases where the subject recognizes the severity of the evidence. The legal team considered this an indication that Evan had no innocent explanation for what had been uncovered. In the observation room, officers watching the interrogation noticed Evan did not refute any element presented. The lack of reaction was not proof of guilt, but in the full context of the case, it fit the entire behavioral pattern outlined by the FBI. This reinforced the belief that the arrest warrant was the correct and necessary step to ensure legal safety for the continued investigation. When the interrogation session ended, Evan was transferred to temporary holding, awaiting his court appearance per protocol. Investigators returned to the file room and entered the final line in the day's report. Arrest warrant executed. Suspect in custody per procedure. After nearly 3 decades in the shadows, Evan's arrest marked the most significant turning point in the entire investigative journey. There was no victory declaration, no fanfare, only work completed according to procedure, meeting legal standards, and built on a chain of evidence accumulated strong enough to advance the case to full criminal investigation level. In the second interrogation session, when all the key evidence was placed right in front of him from Serena's DNA in the pickup truck, the blood-stained clothing unearthed, the cord showing signs of being tightened, the chemical cleaning traces, all the way to the restored 911 recording containing Serena's cries for help and a male voice matching Evan, his long, drawn-out silence finally began to crack. The arms that had stayed crossed over his chest for hours suddenly loosened, fingers twitching slightly with each breath, eyes that had avoided all contact, now staring straight down at the photo of the blood-stained t-shirt on the table. Evan swallowed hard before speaking his first words, low and choked, saying everything that night got out of my control. From that moment, the confession poured out in a steady stream, not rushed from pressure, but the voice of someone who had carried a dark secret too long to keep running from it anymore. Evan recounted that evening, he and Serena had argued more fiercely than ever before. He described the small apartment as becoming a pressure cooker of frustrations that had built up over many days. According to Evan, Serena had insulted his family, something he always saw as the absolute final boundary no one was allowed to cross. Those words, though Evan did not repeat them verbatim, made his voice tremble as he described them, enough for the investigators to understand they struck straight at the most vulnerable place in his pride. She said things I couldn't stand, Evan said, eyes closed as if reliving that moment. He stepped toward Serena in that explosive instant. Not he insisted to attack, but out of rage, wanting her to take back those wounding words. But that moment instantly turned into a struggle. Words flying back and forth, hands pushing, feet backing into the edge of the table, and Serena fell. Evan described the sound of Serena's head hitting the table as a noise he would never forget. A heavy, sharp thud, loud enough to make both of them freeze for a paralyzed second. He said Serena lay still, no response, no movement, and when he touched her shoulder, her breathing was so faint he couldn't tell if it was still there or gone. I thought I had killed her right then, Evan said, voice hoarse. The investigators did not interrupt, but let Evan continue, because what he admitted matched every piece of forensic evidence collected over nearly 3 decades. Evan said he panicked to the point where he could think of nothing except making every trace disappear, as if hiding it could make the truth never have happened. He wrapped Serena in a dark-colored cloth from an old closet, the exact type of fabric Mark had seen Evan pushing into the truck bed, and carried her down the stairs late at night, a time when Evan knew the neighbors usually kept their doors closed. He admitted the blood drops on the rear bed of the pickup truck came from when he placed Serena there. The way he described the position matched exactly where forensics found the trace blood. Evan drove to the plot. He rented behind the apartment complex. The plot satellite Landsat images showed had been dug up and refilled right at that time. He said he dug a shallow hole in a near-numb state, placed Serena inside, and covered it back up. "I didn't stop to think," Evan said. "I was just afraid." But that fear, he said, grew even greater 2 days later when he returned and felt the hole was too shallow. Worried animals or passers-by might discover it. He dug it up again, put Serena back in the truck, and drove to the riverbank south of Jackson. When investigators asked exactly where the body was placed, Evan bowed his head for a very long time before answering, "I let the water take her." This statement explained why no body was found at the plot. Why only the clothing remained buried in trash bags. Why forensics could not trace decomposition. And when Evan described burying the clothing, he admitted he had cut up a few items, put them in trash bags, and buried them at a different spot in the same plot, matching exactly what the excavation team found using GPR. He admitted using a cleaning solution containing sodium hypochlorite to scrub the truck bed, rubbing hard on the metal, exactly what forensics identified through the oxidation streaks and metalware left behind. He admitted wiping the table edge, cleaning the apartment, replacing the rug and covers. Every detail Evan described matched the forensic traces perfectly, from the trace blood on the table edge to the abrasion marks under the truck seats, from the tightened cord to the rips in Serena's clothing. When investigators asked if anyone helped him, Evan immediately shook his head. Mark, according to him, knew nothing. Mark only helped lift the wrapped cloth into the truck without looking inside. Evan stressed there was no accomplice, no conspiracy, no long-term plan. "It was all me," Evan said, hands gripping the table edge tightly. The interrogators continued asking Evan to walk through the timeline again. Evan recounted from the argument, to the 911 call, to when Serena fell, to when he carried her down the stairs. When the 911 recording was played right in front of him, Evan winced, not denying, not evading, but only said, "That was when everything started falling apart." Forensics confirmed every detail Evan described matched. The drying time of blood on the clothing, the blood location in the truck, the way the cord was tightened, the depth of the buried trash bags, the soil disturbance position in the satellite images, the timing when Evan called Mark, and even the camera gap showing no further trace of Serena after she left the complex gate. At the end of the long interrogation session, investigators asked Evan if he wanted to record anything in the official file. Evan stayed silent for a very long time, long enough that the monitor had to repeat the question. Finally, he lifted his head, eyes red but no tears falling, and said, "I didn't mean to hurt her, but I did. And everything after that, I made it so much worse." The statement was read back and signed, with the attorney present. Evan Marshall officially confessed to causing Serena Grant's death and concealing the entire matter for nearly 30 years. The trial of Evan Marshall opened at the Madison County Courthouse in Jackson on a fall morning thick with anticipation. Before Evan was led into the courtroom, the jury had already been walked through the long list of evidence to be presented. Serena's DNA in the pickup truck, the blood-stained clothing unearthed, the cord showing signs of being tightened, the chemical cleaning traces, the dug and refilled soil patch identified by satellite imagery, the restored 911 call, Mark Delaney's witness statement, and finally, Evan's own detailed confession. Everything was arranged in chronological order to recount the night Serena disappeared as one unbroken line with no gaps remaining. The prosecutor stood before the jury and opened with a short statement. "This is not a case of theories. This is a case of evidence." After the preliminary procedures, the prosecution moved into presenting the timeline, a sequence reconstructed from forensics, witness statements, and audio data. The courtroom fell completely silent as the prosecutor began with the argument neighbors heard on the night of June 17, 1996. He described how the sounds of objects crashing echoed through the thin apartment walls, how Serena's cries for help made it onto the 911 line, and how Evan's shout cut over her, silencing her mid-sentence, matching word for word with the voice analysis. Each detail from inside the apartment was recreated with forensic visuals. The table edge where Serena's head struck, the trace blood collected but unanalyzable at the time, the disarray in the kitchen, the absence of any sign of forced entry from outside. The prosecutor emphasized that all of this aligned precisely with Evan's confession, especially the part where he described losing control after Serena insulted his family the moment that led to the fatal fall. As the timeline advanced to the stage where Evan carried Serena out of the apartment and placed her in the rear bed of the pickup truck, the jury was shown forensic scene photos from the scrapyard where the vehicle was recovered. Images appeared on the screen. Oxidation streaks from cleaning agents on metal, deep parallel scrubbing marks, and the blood location matching Evan's description. The prosecutor used a laser pointer to highlight exactly where forensics found Serena's DNA, and how it aligned with Evan's account of placing her in that spot. No one can explain this match except the defendant's own words, the prosecutor said, voice steady but firm. When the presentation reached Evan's drive to the rented plot of land, the prosecutor displayed Landsat satellite images alongside the GPR analysis chart, showing the soil disturbance right in the time frame of Serena's disappearance. The map was enlarged for the jury to see each subsurface reflection point, the location of the trash bag with Serena's clothing, the suspected binding cord, and the other clustered trash bags. The prosecutor called the forensic expert to explain to the jury why the clothing remained but no body was found. The expert clearly stated, "At the plot, only items were buried. The body may have been moved elsewhere," perfectly consistent with Evan's confession that he dug it up a second time and took Serena to the riverbank. No one in the jury looked away from the screen when the forensic conclusion appeared. Blood sample on the clothing has a 100% DNA match with Serena Grant. The prosecutor then called Mark Delaney to the stand. Mark walked up, visibly nervous, but with a steadier voice than during his interview. He had waited nearly 30 years to tell what he had kept hidden. "Evan came to my house that night. He wanted me to help lift something very heavy into his truck. He was shaking, and he didn't seem like his normal self." Mark recounted every detail exactly as recorded, and when the prosecutor asked, "Did you suspect at the time what you were helping lift?" Mark paused for a few seconds before answering, "I always had a bad feeling, but I was afraid to know the truth." Two jurors in the front row lowered their heads. The air grew thick with heaviness. After the prosecution had presented all the forensic elements and witness testimony, he moved to motive the part the law requires to be clearly established for the appropriate degree of homicide charge. Drawing from Evan's confession and the FBI behavioral analysis, the prosecutor asserted that the motive was not premeditated murder, not a long-term scheme, but a rage killing, a spontaneous act of violence triggered when insulted or psychologically threatened. The prosecutor said, "The defendant did not plan to kill Serena, but when she said things that made him feel his family honor was humiliated, he lost control. And everything that followed: disposal, trace erasure, apartment cleanup, truck scrubbing, was aimed at covering up a single moment of violence." The defense attorney tried to counter that this was an accident, but the prosecutor immediately pointed out, if it was an accident, then why dig a grave to hide it? Why move the body a second time? Why scrub the truck with strong chemicals? Why stuff the clothing into trash bags and bury them? An accident does not require disposal, the prosecutor concluded. The jury was played the restored 911 recording once more. The courtroom fell completely silent as Serena's faint but clear cries for help echoed, followed by Evan's loud shout cutting her off. One juror placed a hand over their chest. Another glanced toward Evan. Evan sat with his head bowed, no reaction. The recording ended with a hard impact, the sound of Serena being silenced mid-sentence. The prosecutor added no further words, letting the audio speak for itself about the nature of that night. When deliberations began, no one knew how long the jury would take to reach a verdict, given the volume of evidence and the decades-long case requiring a high standard of certainty. But after just over 4 hours, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict sheet, voice clear. We find the defendant, Evan Marshall, guilty of second-degree murder. Evan did not lift his head. The judge read the sentence. 30 years imprisonment. The penalty fit the sentencing range for homicide without prior intent, but involving serious violence and prolonged concealment. When the gavel came down, the courtroom remained quiet. There were no cheers, no applause. Only the sense that the case had finally reached the point where the law could deliver an answer. Evan was led out of the courtroom in a gray prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed, steps slow like someone finally forced to look directly at the truth he had fled for so long. Right after Evan Marshall's sentence was pronounced, the TBI proceeded to compile the entire nearly 3-decade investigative process into an official report. This report, more than 300 pages thick, not only chronicled the case's developments but also dissected every mistake, every technological limitation, and every advancement in forensic science throughout the period from Serena Grant's disappearance until the case was closed. This summary was not intended to assign blame to any individual, but to identify the weaknesses in the legal system as it existed in 1996, weaknesses that prolonged the path to justice for Serena. The opening section of the report went straight to the most serious error. The evidence envelope containing the torn fabric piece and blood-stained hair, collected from Evan's pickup truck in 1996, but mislabeled and misplaced in the evidence storage. This loss meant the sample was never sent to the lab during the critical early phase of the investigation. At that time, DNA technology was not advanced enough to analyze trace amounts, but the envelope's misplacement ensured that even when technology improved, no one knew the evidence still existed. The report stated clearly, this was a systemic error, not an individual one. The evidence, classification, and storage process lacked cross-verification layers, resulting in a critical piece of evidence being placed in the wrong storage area for 18 years. The TBI acknowledged that if the envelope had been correctly stored and submitted for analysis when DNA technology advanced in the early 2000s, the case could have been reopened more than a decade earlier. But rather than dwelling on regret for lost opportunities, the report used Serena's case as proof of the need for comprehensive reform in evidence management procedures. A major chapter detailed the new process. Every piece of evidence, beyond paper labels, must have a digital identification code. Every movement must be logged in an electronic tracking system, and storage facilities must undergo periodic inventory scans using barcode tools to detect discrepancies immediately. The next chapter focused on the impact of modern DNA technology, the decisive factor in solving the case. In 1996, DNA analysis required large, nearly intact samples. Serena's blood trace on the fabric in the envelope was only microscopic and unprocessable with the era's technology. But by 2024, low copy number LCN DNA technology had become powerful enough to decode samples as small as a few micrograms of biological material. Evidence once worthless became pivotal. The report stressed, without next-generation DNA technology, this case might have remained in the cold case category indefinitely. Each forensic step from identifying DNA in the truck, matching it to blood on Serena's clothing, to analyzing cleaning chemicals was presented as proof of the irreplaceable role of forensic science in no-body homicide cases. The report did not stop there. It devoted considerable space to audio processing technology and AI voice analysis, which opened an entirely new door when the misclassified 911 recording was recovered. This was the first time in Tennessee state investigative history that an audio recording more than 20 years old was enhanced using AI for criminal investigation purposes. In the report, the audio expert wrote, without modern technology, Serena's cry for help would have remained buried forever in background noise. The report also emphasized that the breakthrough came from the combination of technology and human persistence. It was not just DNA or AI software, but the investigators' decision to re-review old files, spot anomalies in the evidence catalog, question the land lease contracts, and re-interview Mark after nearly 30 years. All these steps contributed to cracking the case. Each action was one piece. Each question uncovered seemingly minor information, but when placed together, they formed a complete picture. The report devoted several pages to analyzing the decision to reclassify the case from missing person to homicide investigation, a crucial legal turning point. This was a classic example of how forensics can speak even without a body. The physical evidence was strong enough, witness statements aligned, the timeline was airtight, and the confession was consistent, all combined to create a complete legal basis for charges. This was what the prosecutors and investigators wanted to highlight. Justice rests on evidence, not speculation or intuition. And in Serena Grant's case, that evidence arrived late, but it arrived. When all the analysis sections were complete, the final page of the report stated clearly, "The Serena Grant file is closed with full criminal resolution." That note not only marked the end of one case but also put a period on 3 decades of unanswered questions for Serena's family. The final investigator signed the file and added one brief but weighty line, "Delayed, but not denied." In the press release issued afterward, the TBI referred to the case as a prime example of what is now called DNA-delayed justice. Justice postponed by technological limits, but ultimately delivered through scientific progress. Serena Grant's case will be taught in forensic classes across Tennessee as proof that no body cases can still be solved, that even the smallest piece of evidence can hold the answer, that justice does not always arrive on time, but it can arrive if the system preserves every fragment with absolute precision. When the file was finally sealed, there was no ceremony, no major press conference, just documents placed in a box, sealed, and archived as a record of an era. Serena Grant's case ended with a sentence in the Jackson courtroom, but it will live on in Tennessee's forensic history as testimony to the power of technology, the persistence of investigators, and the costly lesson that a single small error in evidence management can delay justice for nearly 30 years. The story of Serena Grant, a young woman who vanished in silence and only regained her voice after nearly 3 decades, is not merely a personal tragedy, but a mirror reflecting many issues Americans still face today. Intimate partner violence, the fearful silence of witnesses, a legal system dependent on evidence management, and both the power and limitations of forensic technology. Looking back at the case's journey, several key points stand out for reflection. The argument inside the apartment, heard by neighbors, but never intervened in, shows that domestic violence rarely begins with extreme acts. It often starts with insults, unresolved hurts, prolonged silences. Serena's 911 call reveals another truth. Many victims cannot escape danger if the surrounding community does not notice or does not know how to respond. The detail of the evidence envelope lost for 18 years reminds us that justice in the United States, however strong, can still be delayed by systemic errors. Modern DNA breaking the case demonstrates that investing in forensic science is not just technical improvement, it is about saving voices thought to be buried forever. And Evan's confession, losing control simply because he felt insulted, serves as a reminder that mental health, emotional self-control, and education about intimate partner violence remain urgent issues. From this story, the practical lesson for Americans today is clear. Pay closer attention to danger signals in relationships. Speak up if you hear a cry for help. Respect the importance of preserving evidence. And trust in the value of science on the path to justice. Serena cannot return, but her story may save others. If you are interested in journeys like Serena Grant's pursuit of justice, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to uncover truths that have long been buried and demand to be brought to light.